matter. All right, we're recording, everyone. Welcome back. Kevin and I are going to do part 2, or the next part of our Road to Serfdom series here. Kevin, why don't you give people a brief recap on what we did last time?
Yeah. So episode 1, we just covered the introductory material. Now that normally doesn't sound like a lot, but since this book has been released and re-released and covered by so many different people, there was like 10 introductions, 5 forewords, and 18 prefaces. So it's like so much different material there. Yeah, it's like a third of the book was literally just this material. So what we covered last time was just the introductions, forwards, prefaces for the 44, 56, 76, 94, and 2007 releases of the book. And some of these releases included the new American paperback edition of the book, which is important. I'll get to it in a little bit. But outside of Hayek and others introducing the material of the book, they also talked about how it was received in Europe compared to America. And this distinction is important because the Europeans already had the experience with socialism and collectivism that made the material in the original version fairly obvious and believable. Whereas in America, they lacked that experience with socialism and collectivism in practice, which made the book much more profound and even led to major pushback from almost exclusively academics who were in favor of those things.
Progressive academics.
Oh, for sure. But there is one other very important detail that we need to highlight from the outset, and I think we might need to highlight this basically at the beginning of every single episode, and that is the understanding of liberalism in the European sense compared to the sense in the United States, because they mean two completely different things, where liberalism in the original European sense is to live largely free of government coercion or control. I mean, that you want to live free of some third party trying to interfere in your life. But liberalism in America means almost the exact opposite of its original meaning, in that liberal has come to mean the advocacy of almost every kind of government control. Completely the opposite. And the reason for this is actually something we're going to get into today. So really that brings us up to now. And if you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's a great introduction to this material, a little bit on Hayek's history as well. And also kind of goes into our personal story as to why, what led us to this book and why we wanted to read it originally.
Yep. No, that's a great introduction there, Kevin. People need to understand that when we are quoting Hayek here and when we're discussing it, like, they really need to kind of train their brain to hear liberal and liberalism and think basically the same way they would like about in the modern context, like conservative or libertarian kind of thing. That modern in America, liberal is like synonymous with leftist or progressive, and it's the exact opposite. So whenever we're making defenses of liberalism, making defenses of what the liberal order is, and when Hayek is he draws a lot of he will compare and contrast liberalism with socialism, or liberalism with fascism, or liberalism. He'll conflate sometimes like liberalism and democracy in some ways, and so think about it as liberalism is freedom, like you would maybe think libertarian or conservative, not this leftist garbage that we see today. And so
I like that important little detail there, because one of the things I hate, and just as Hayek projected his scorn as to why he does not understand why American liberals allowed the word to be used like this, because it took away all the power, and now they're defined as conservatives, which means, again, something completely different in Europe. But now, the other side of that coin is the way we use it. A lot of conservatives use it as a pejorative, or they use the word like libtard, and that also hurts them, because it's like, what do you mean? You hate people who love liberty? That's against your thing. It's like, why are you doing it? So it just creates all this stupid confusion that is completely unnecessary. And so it's really, really good that we understand, the base, exactly what we're talking about here, because we use liberalism 100 times, and Hayek also made it a point to make this distinction. So it's good that we make it at the beginning.
Yep. And there's going to be other words we're going to have to do that with, like individualism, and I think democracy probably in some cases. But I mean, it's important to note that word game is intentional on the part of those who are using it in a different way and trying to hijack something and infiltrate it and exploit that existing system. And we'll get into that at the beginning of chapter 2. But that word game is very much intentional on the part of those doing it. So that brings us up to speed. So today we're going to be going over chapter 1 and chapter 2 of The Road to Serfdom. So again, for those of you who Didn't watch the first video, you should. We're going to include a link to a PDF for free where you can follow along with us if you'd like on your computer. And then, as Kevin mentioned in the last video, it's also free for download on Audible. So just a reminder for you folks that is available, and you should totally utilize it. All right, Kevin. So we're starting out with chapter 1, the abandoned road. And so one of the things that Hayek seems to go over here, and what I like about the way he writes, tell me what you think about this, is that it seems like he's very meticulously building a case. And there's the road to serfdom, and before he goes into what that road is, he first begins with this, what he calls the abandoned road, and which really is the road that brought society so much freedom and prosperity in the first place. And, one of the themes of the first chapter of the book is he's saying, look at the system that we used to build up society from nothing, from people just in squalor and in rigid, class hierarchies, to where we have freedom and advances in science and in medicine and upward mobility, for some, for more people than others. But generally, things have gotten better as we have utilized this system of freedom as opposed to coercion. And so he does a good job, I think, in this first chapter, kind of highlighting, when he says the abandoned road, he's like, here's the road that brought us here. And then there are all these people now who think that we can, instead of trying to stay on it, and even, not saying it's perfect, but to even just how can we maintain or tweak it a little bit, improve it, but who are like, let's literally destroy the whole thing and try some new thing and just hope that it actually gets better results. And so it seems like he does a really good job of laying out this case of history in really general terms, which we'll get to here in a minute, before getting into the specifics of, okay, but this is what you're rejecting in favor of this new thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, what I like, and what I think I might have mentioned in the first episode is, I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell. I like him because he hits you over the head with empirical evidence. That's why I always say to any leftist, I see it's like, all right, you read all of these other books, but let's put those books aside and read a book that kind of goes against your narrative, and you would probably get a concussion with how hard he's going to hit you over the head with all this empirical evidence. But what I love about Hayek is like the logic center of Thomas Sowell's brain. He hits you over the head with this just logical comparisons and with a lot of historical facts and findings that show the progression of these ideas through just a logical standpoint. So he truly hits you over the head with how hard he's going to be able to lay out what these people thought at this time and how they progressed from there, and also tracking those trends with other countries like England and America. And that's why it was so profound to people in both of those countries.
Yeah, and one of the ways that he does that, and I totally agree, and one of the ways he does that, like he incorporates logic, I think, with, maybe it's something with a European style or sensibility, but he does a good job of basically hitting you with brutal realities here and criticism without it necessarily coming across as you could miss it, I guess, is my point. And just how he opens the first chapter of, how he's basically saying that, well, you have the quote right here, we are ready to accept almost any explanation of the present crisis of our civilization except one, that the present state of the world may be the result of genuine error on our part, and that the pursuit of some of our most cherished ideals has apparently produced results utterly different from those we expected. And the point is that he opens it by pointing out that there are all these intellectuals advocating for this stuff. And we see this today, but where they're so convinced of the rightness of their goals, they're so convinced of the purity of their intentions that they don't have the self-awareness to stop and ask, okay, are the methods I'm using to go about achieving these goals actually creating the desired result? I mean, that's a Thomas Sowell thing, talking about feedback mechanisms. And Hayek is saying, you want to blame all of these things, the ignorance of our elders. You want to blame evil systems. You want to blame capitalism. You want to blame these bad countries or whatever. And you'll blame anyone except for yourself or the ideas themselves, because you lack the self-awareness to ask if maybe you made a mistake. And that, again, to that quote where he says, the pursuit of our most cherished ideals might have created the exact opposite. But those people, I mean, we see this with, things like war on poverty or welfare programs, or all these other things. It's supposed to bring people out of poverty, but it keeps them in poverty. A lot of things like No Child Left Behind ends up leaving every child behind. You know, there are these things that are, as Sol would say, to quote him again, it's like they're being judged by the name, like the name of it. Like it's, the name is supposed to, it has nothing to do with what it's doing. Like diversity training doesn't mean that you actually train someone in diversity, you know? And so Hayek is saying
the Patriot Act didn't create patriots.
That is correct. And exactly. Yeah. And so he's saying, like, at the start of this, and what I like about this, you know, before we move on, is it seems like he's making the case that, you know, things we've talked about before, is that there is a pride in a lot of the people who are so convinced by their intentions that prevents them from stopping to look at the actual outcomes. And so everything he's about to get into, he's saying, you guys need to take a step back from your own pride and your own, you know, certitude of your moral superiority, and look at what your ideas actually create. And before we do that, let's look at the things you're opposed to and see what that created. And that was that kind of stumbling upon freedom that he moves into after that part.
Yeah. I mean, I think this idea that it was some other force outside of, you know, our control that screwed this whole thing up so we can just retry it again, that lends itself to the next excuse, which is this thing that I like hasn't really been tried, and that's why it's been a disaster throughout history. He starts out this chapter with a quote from FDR, quoting about the same thing, where you know, he's just saying you can really claim that you can do anything just by saying it hasn't been tried. And all that really means is when someone says socialism can work, this hasn't been tried, just means that I haven't tried it yet. And you believe that you can do it right. And there's an excellent 60-second clip from Jordan Peterson, who's giving one of his talks before he got super famous, but it was just a lecture, you know, explaining to the kids in the hall that, you know, everyone says that I could have done it better if it was just me. If I had all that control, I could have done it better. And that is an insane way to think, because the people who are actually pure of heart who would have done it better, those are the first people who get shot in the back. And it's with your control saying, oh man, how do I correct this injustice? You will do some really, really bad things to correct injustices that you believe are truly horrible. And then you're going to find yourself being the monster and being capable of all these awful things once you have that power and the ability to control everyone else's life.
Yep. And again, if you are the type of person who really wouldn't do that, then you'd be dead, because the system you advocated for would necessitate your destruction.
Well, it also incentivized bad actors to shoot you in the back. I mean,
exactly.
We'll get into how liberalism kind of lent itself to its own destruction. We'll get to that in a little bit, but it's kind of the same theory where, you know, if you're going to allow all these ideas to flourish, some bad ideas are going to come in and then it can destroy you and your ideas.
Yeah. And one of the ways that, I mean, he highlights it here is like you said, is that people with these good intentions, but also the pride and the lack of self-awareness to look at the outcomes of their intentions, they'll say instead that this didn't happen because of some nefarious force. And the way that you conquer a nefarious force is through the request of power. And so it's give us power so we can accomplish X. Okay, X isn't being accomplished. So it's either we don't have enough power, we don't have enough money, you know, this government program, you know, whatever, we need more funding. Or these folks are trying to stop it. So give us more power so we can oppose these forces, and then we can accomplish X. Oh, well, X hasn't gotten there, and then you just find a new thing and you rinse and repeat but all of it is the pursuit of power, which we'll get to again, he brings up later. But again, we see this today where it's like, okay, vote us in. Oh, but we need to get rid of the filibuster, or we need to pack the Supreme Court. We need more power. We need to tip the odds more in our favor, so we can truly get these things accomplished. And then it's all just that pursuit of more and more consolidation of power.
And you see this a lot with stuff that is much smaller in scope as well. So he talks about in the introduction that this book is not just to say that socialism is bad, because then all the people who advocate for these socialist policies is going to say, well, this isn't socialism. This is just a social program by itself. Well, you see, you know, public school saying we're just always underfunded. That's like the only excuse public education has, is we're underfunded. And it's like, no, you need to expand this more to anything that takes freedom away from you and allows the state more coercion, even if it's not at a mass scale, it's just in this one industry, or it eliminates competition and incentivizes, it goes away from individualism and moves toward collectivism, even in that one small industry. Be aware of it, because this is what's going to happen. They're always going to ask for more power.
Yep. And one of the things I think why Hayek is warning against this here is he gets to where he's like, what we're seeing now is, he alludes to it here, where it's like, it's looking like the Allies are going to win the war. And he's saying that people advocating for this stuff now are making the mistake of thinking that these, like the ways in which this didn't work or it went wrong in these other countries like Italy, Germany, whatever, well, that's a German thing, or that's an Italian thing. And Hayek is saying, no, this is just an idea thing. And so you can't make the mistake of thinking that this is like the ways in which these ideas go off the rails are confined to national borders. They're not. It's just, this is what happens when you implement these things, period. And so he was seeing a lot of people deflect to, that's just a Germany thing. And we see that today kind of in the opposite, where it's like, no, we don't mean communist socialism. We mean like Sweden, or something like that. We mean like a Nordic model of socialism. And it's like a deflection no, this is where it actually works or whatever. And it's not this. And it's like, no, this is what these ideas mean. And of course, in the places they point to, it's not actually socialism. And they will say as much, but anyway, but it's a similar kind of thing as today. So do you want to get into the part where he kind of talks, before we get into, well, there's this one part here that I think is an important note and something we'll come back to, especially at the end as we talk about criticisms, when he talks about just the how changes happen incrementally, and how his point there at the end is that this change, these gradual changes, moving away from individualism towards socialism and stuff, it's not just a change in policy, but how you. And again, this is where he starts to build the argument of the road that they abandoned. Before that, he says, look, whenever you change these policies, you change the culture of a society. Whenever you start to implement these changes and add more coercion, add more collectivist stuff, you start to change the culture of a society. And you incrementally, by doing that, you don't just by changing the culture, you change the trajectory of that society. And so again, that's where, if we're looking at roads, he's like, we're at a fork in the road, basically. In some ways, there's a road that's brought us here. And now by changing the culture and trying to advocate for these policies, you're taking us off the road that got us here and onto a road that leads somewhere else, and that you might not see it right now. But these gradual changes will change the culture, which change where we're heading, as a society. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's a really good quote from the introduction that, or it wasn't even by him, I think it was by Hume, that you don't lose all liberty and all freedom all at once. Like it never just happens in a snapshot. And that's what a lot of people who think like, oh, that can never be us, it's a German thing, it's an Italian thing, that is them just kind of pushing off that responsibility and saying, well, we're gonna, liberalism's already here. It's ingrained in our society now. We don't have to worry about it going away. And you'll quickly see that, people are going to really reverse track and scrap everything because something is not moving fast enough. Normally is the excuse, right? So, I mean, it's a good point that this stuff happens a little bit at a time. And then once that dam breaks, then it goes to in a bad direction really fast, as you can see what happened in Europe.
Do you want to get into the words part? Because there's that funny part. Again, as we mentioned earlier, guys, there's this word play, that we see where liberalism is hijacked by, well, we'll get into that later, but liberalism meant this one thing. Mm-hmm. And then Hayek has this quote about freedom and liberty, and he also includes the word tolerance in there. And it's pretty funny how even like if you were to if you were to read that today, you would go, oh yeah, here's one of the things that actually doesn't apply today. One of the thoughts.
Yeah, so a good a quote we pulled that, yeah, it did make me laugh. I even called Truman after it. It's like, oh man, if he even knew how
Yep.
wrong in this little aspect he would be, but he hit it on the rest of it. But quote is quote, freedom and liberty are now words so worn with use and abuse that one must hesitate to employ them to express the ideals for which they stood during that period. Tolerance is perhaps the only word which preserves full meaning of the principle which during the whole of this period was in the ascendant and which only in recent times has again been in decline, to disappear completely with the rise of the totalitarian state. So the implication here is totalitarianism rise because now all of a sudden this tolerance idea that was kind of growing and cultivating and to its ascendant, it kind of died because in place of it moved totalitarianism. Now the funny thing is today, and you put a little note down here, tolerance LOL, I thought was hilarious. It's like he thought, tolerance was this thing that was going to save them if they maintained, the definition and kept using it. Totalitarianism wasn't come. Now if he'd have, came to 2021, I think he quickly realized that tolerance is another one of these words, just like freedom and liberty, that's been completely hijacked to mean something completely different. It's tolerance to tolerate ideas as long as they agree with your narrative. If they're not in your narrative, then they must not be tolerated.
Exactly. It's the tolerance is intolerance. Tolerate everything. It means agreement. But really, that illustrates his point, right? Is that freedom and liberty, even 80 years ago, freedom and liberty are words that had been hijacked. Liberalism, all of these things. Later on, we'll see words like equality and justice get hijacked. And he's like, well, but tolerance is safe. And now we fast forward in that incremental shift that he's talking about has taken place, and tolerance has also been abandoned. I think it'd be interesting, as an aside, I just had this thought to make like some type of appendix, just a list of here's all the words that now mean literally the exact opposite of what they meant, 20 years ago.
You read 1984, he did put an appendix in there that had like an alternative, that basically had its own dictionary in there. And and so that was extremely thorough. I can only imagine the painstaking time he took. Also, by the way, like we mentioned in the last one, that Orwell took a little bit from Hayek here when writing, especially 1984, which came out 5 years after this was published.
Animal Farm was like the next year. Animal Farm was the year after this was published. I think Animal Farm was 45, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it's exactly right. So the next part of the chapter, Hayek does this thing that I think is really, really good, and this is something that I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, which is where he lays the foundation of how did we build such a prosperous society, and he goes into, and this is why this chapter is called The Abandoned Road, right? And so he's talking about, here's the road that we just stumbled upon really in the beginning that led us to make such remarkable advancements over the last, let's say 100 to 200 years. And we're now going to abandon this, I guess, in favor of some, utopian belief that we can do it differently and somehow be better. But he does a good job of laying out exactly what the formula is that got them there. And he begins by talking about how men's ability to grow and prosper that they noticed in history was related to the commerce systems. And that basically any place, and I think he tracks us back to Italy. There's another book called, oh my gosh, it's going to drive me crazy. I'll think of it later. That talks about this also, that tracks this stuff and goes back to Italy and I think maybe Florence. But basically, whenever they first started experimenting with what is based in a lot of ways laissez-faire, where men had the freedom to do things, to set up business and trade with each other without, Hayek calls it despotic political power, but basically just government meddling and intervention, freedom of commerce spread and blossomed. And with that, there was wealth that was created. And so he's saying that the way he puts it is, quote, the realization that spontaneous and uncontrolled efforts of individuals were capable of producing a complex order of economic activities could come only after this development had made some progress. And I put, quote or translation, freedom creates prosperity. And the example, I gave you before we started was, it's kind of like whenever you're in a relationship and you're just figuring out what are the things the other person likes, doesn't like, what works, what pisses them off. You don't necessarily have the realization of those patterns right away, but eventually you go, oh, aha, like my wife really likes it when I do this, or really hates it whenever I do this. And so I'm going to do more of those things. And so he's saying, for whatever reason, luck, happenstance, there were these places where people did have some freedom to engage in commerce and pursue their own desires as they wanted, and wealth was created. And so once it had been going on for a while, then we're able to look back and observe it and go, oh, we should do more of that. We should do more of that. But really, I mean, it almost seems like he's saying we kind of happened upon this thing.
Yeah. And the best way, I mean, this is life, right? I always make the joke, or there was a stand-up comedian who made the really good joke. It's like, you're a little kid and you always look up to your parents and they always know what to do. Every adult knows what to do. And then you grow up and you realize no one knows what they're doing. This kind of guess and check game that you have to play. But the useful part of a guess and check game is when you take data and you analyze data and say, okay, we did this thing, we found ourselves to be more prosperous here. Or free trade was much more wide open. Now everyone's ship rose, right?
Yep.
And that's, I mean, Hayek is an economist. There's no, obviously he would think this way. And it's people ignoring those trends or saying those trends aren't fast enough, or we're going to compare those trends and the standards back, 100 years ago to our standards today, and how awful was it back then? So we got to scrap everything. We'll get to a quote about that later. But you have to analyze the data and understand what direction we're moving. And when you see yourself trending in the right direction, don't scrap everything, right? There are tweaks and changes you can make, but if you're heading down the right path, the right road, the worst thing you can do is completely abandon it, right? You maybe make a little bit changes, make some deviations, clean up the road, but if you just go off on a different path, or you just go off-roading, effectively is what I think a lot of people are trying to do. That's when you get into a mess. You don't go off-roading in your Prius. I've tried it. It never works.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
I'm glad you got rid of that Prius though. Yeah. And he also talks about how it leads to explosion of growth in science. It's funny. He talks about like little mechanical gadgets and toys that were created. And one of the thoughts I had is like, just contrast these things, right? Think about like the Dark Ages, when freedom was stifled, like there wasn't any growth, and the Renaissance came after that, when growth was allowed, when there was more freedom. And he makes the comparison that Nazism was like an anti-Renaissance, it was anti-freedom, it was anti-growth, it was anti-liberty. And, I thought that he said that freedom, allows those who are inclined and have the ability to do so to take risks in pursuit of whatever it is they think might work. And, and the thought I had is like, the airplane was invented by bicycle makers. The Wright brothers owned a bicycle shop. And so like, that's an example of how you give people freedom to, one, you can go and become a bicycle maker. You can have a bicycle shop if you want. And then, no one's getting in your way. You want to try to build an airplane, go for it, but that's what freedom creates, is things like that and innovation. Whereas, the opposite of it stifles innovation and stifles.
But it also uses incentives as compared to coercion. There's a big difference between those two. When you can incentivize people to make progress and make their own lives better, that's a lot better than coercing them to try to make everyone's life better, or whatever specified group at that time, where you have to plan it. You have to pick and choose what groups you want to say, all right, time to make their lives better, but it's going to be at the expense of someone else.
Yep. So how do you care if I read through? So sure. For people listening or watching, so there's like the next section has some big long quotes that we're going to kind of unpack, but it's important because it establishes a couple things. One is the necessity of the connection between what made society work, what works, and our understanding of those things. You have to have both. It's not you can't just have things that work. You have to also understand how they work so you can replicate them, and you can avoid doing different things, right? So you can avoid doing different things. That's the scientific method, is you catalog the things that work, you try them, you repeat them, and you try to lean into those things. And the opposite of that is you are avoiding doing the things that don't work and that haven't worked. So you have to be connected intellectually, consciously, to the process that led you there, the process of success. And so he's documenting the breakdown of the process and a societal understanding and respect for that process and the consequences of abandoning that. And so, Kevin, how about I read some of this stuff, and then I'll stop, and then you can just kind of unpack it. Does that sound good? So here's the beginning. So he says, as is so often true, the nature of our civilization has been seen more clearly by its enemies than by most of its friends. The perennial Western malady, the revolt of the individual against the species, as the 19th century totalitarian Auguste Comte, has described it, was indeed the force which built our civilization. What the 19th century added to the individualism of the preceding period was merely to make all classes conscious of freedom, to develop systematically and continuously what had grown in a haphazard and patchy manner, and to spread it through Europe and Holland and most of the European continent. The result of this growth surpassed all expectations. Wherever the barriers to free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, many became rapidly able to satisfy ever-widening ranges of desire. And while the rising standards soon led to the discovery of very dark spots in society, spots which men were no longer willing to tolerate, there was probably no class that did not substantially benefit from the general advance. We cannot do justice to this astonishing growth if we measure it by our present standards, which themselves result from this growth and now make many defects obvious. To appreciate what it meant to those who took part in it, we must measure it by the hopes and wishes men held when it began. And there can be no doubt that its success surpassed man's wildest dreams, that by the beginning of the 20th century, the working man in the Western world had reached a degree of material comfort, security, and personal independence which 100 years before had seemed scarcely possible. And this is the last part here, and then we'll unpack. What in the future will probably appear most significant and far-reaching effect of this success is the new sense of power over their own fate, the belief in the unbound possibilities of improving their own lot, which the success already achieved created among men. With the success grew ambition, and man had every right to be ambitious. What had been an inspiring promise seemed no longer enough, the rate of progress far too slow, and the principles which had made this progress possible in the past came to be regarded more as obstacles to speedier progress, impatiently to be brushed away than as the conditions for the preservation and development of what had already been achieved.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch there, but I like in the first paragraph, something you talked about before, that you can't really, it's hard to assess the situation while being in it, but from the outside of it, you can see it a bit better. So I think you brought up a really good one before we started this recording, how China knows us, how China knows how to manipulate our markets because they're standing from the outside and they don't really engage in any sort of free markets, or they do, as one solid nation doing it. But they definitely don't play by the same rules we do. That way they can kind of see from the outside and see how we work inside of our markets, our incentives, and they're able to manipulate it there, and they're very effective in doing that. But I also think a good example of this, I've been reading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and he even talks about how truly bad people are bad because they don't understand what bad is. Good people understand that they're doing bad because they can recognize it and compare it to the good things they're doing, and they can say, oh, this is bad. I can tell that I did something here. So it's something that you can kind of see yourself when you're moving in that direction. And then the next paragraph, I really like this one because it's something I also had highlighted as well, is just comparing yourself with different standards, especially yourself compared to 100 years ago. So there's definitely two directions you can go. You can say, oh, my situation now is not great. I don't own my own property. I'm not doing very good in my career. But if you compare your status to where you are today to 100 years ago, and you put yourself back 100 years ago, and you look at yourself, it's like, man, you're living like a king. This is crazy how far we've progressed. It's amazing. But you also look in the other direction where we say, oh man, those people 100 years ago, they believed in some great things, but they held slaves, like awful people. So we project our standards onto them a long time ago. And we say, since they were awful people, we're going to scrap everything they believed in and everything they do. And what you're doing is you're knocking out the building blocks of liberalism. And you're saying, all right, out with those because bad people believed in those. And now you have nothing. Your principles don't stand on anything. And that's how they fall down so easily. So that's the reason I really enjoyed that quote. And then sorry, I'm trying to unpack these all at the same time.
No, you're good. Go for it.
So yeah, we see the progress of liberalism, the trend toward more freedom, more prosperity. But once we get all this prosperity and all this all these fun toys and everything and all these new freedoms. When we see people that don't have these freedoms, we get super disgusted. And we're like, what's happening right now is going way too slow. Yeah, maybe we're trending in the right direction, but since it's going too slow, maybe it's time to scrap this and doing something that can involve a more speedier process, like he quotes here. And that is when you get yourself into trouble. That is when you say, all right, trending, good, not trending fast enough, scrap that, give us more power so we can do this in a day, right? And that is when you gave up the power. Maybe that good thing might have happened, but now at what expense did that good thing happen, rather than happening more organically with people in free trade?
Well, and one of the things that he says there, that you hit on that I like before that, as he says, we cannot do justice to this astonishing growth if we measure it by our present standards, which themselves result from this growth and now make many defects obvious. And so the irony is our amazing standards of living is what makes the defects so glaring, because most people are so far removed from abject poverty, from absolute zero, that it makes defects obvious, because we don't understand that the way we even notice it is because there's something to contrast it against. When you're a peasant in 1300, you don't look around going, God, this is the worst. Look at Jim over there up the street. He's got it way better than me. Or these people over here have it way worse. It's like, no, everyone's poor. Everyone's destitute. Everyone is in a hellish existence that they will not escape, and they will die probably cold and alone and hungry. And that's what everyone's in. And so the point is that those defects that people are impatient to try and address, the reason we even understand their existence is because of the progress we've made, and the system that they're criticizing that will address those defects, maybe not as fast as they'd like, but will do it, is the system that allowed them to even notice it in the first place. And so it's completely ironic. And again, goes back to where he's saying you need to have some humility and self-awareness here. And I like that he said that people had every right to be ambitious. And again, he's saying we found out that the system worked, so we wanted it to keep working, but we got so far removed from what it was doing, from what was necessary for it, that we became preoccupied with things that would probably destroy it. And I love this last quote here again. Like, so many of these are just things that I just like want to have like on my wall, or like pinned tweet or something. But what had been an inspiring promise no longer seemed enough. The rate of progress far too slow. And then this is it right here. The principles which had made this progress possible in the past came to be regarded more as obstacles to speedier progress, impatiently to be brushed away, than as the conditions for the preservation and development of what had already been achieved. And we see that, everything about his making observations about the way this gradually erodes society, gradually changes culture, gradually gets people to give up their freedoms and liberty and move more from an individual to a collective thing. We're seeing that there are all these things that even in Hayek's day, people were saying that was fine then, we don't need that now. There's a Medium article that I still can't bring myself to close the tab because it reminds me of the what we're up against, and it's called "We Need to Abandon Our childish obsession with the Constitution." And it's like, we just need to literally get rid of the Constitution. And it's just this naive thing where it's like the principles that created, the most prosperous, freest society in the world, in the history of the world, well, those aren't necessary to maintain it. We don't need that to maintain the freedom we have, of I can turn the lights on, and I can open the faucet and clean water comes out. We don't need those things. And it's so naive. And then, so can we do the same thing? I'll read this next part where he talks about it being penetrated and just, So he talks about basically people start to criticize liberalism. Again, liberalism is like, it's freedom, think liberty. Don't think like crazy, like AOC stuff. Liberalism was further weakened by the inevitably slow progress of a policy which aimed at gradual improvement of the institutional framework of a free society. This progress depended on the growth of our understanding of the social forces and conditions most favorable to their working in a desirable manner. Since the task was to assist, and where necessary to supplement their operation, the first requisite was to understand them. The attitude of the liberal towards society is that like a gardener who tends a plant, and in order to create the conditions most favorable for its growth, must know as much as possible about its structure and the way it functions. And so he acknowledges that the understanding of this, has been gradual, but you still have to understand it. I think about like an idiocracy. They didn't understand plants, so they're trying to water them with energy drinks, and they can't get anything to grow. And so Hayek is saying you have to understand the conditions necessary for growth in order to be a person who is a good farmer. Does a farmer put work into growing the plant? Yeah, but it's a mixture of they put some work in, but then their hands are off of it, and it's more about maintaining the ecosystem and the conditions of growth than them forcing the growth. They're not like they're pulling on the plant and getting it to grow. It's just, I'm going to put some work in, but that work is mostly around the maintenance of conditions than it is around anything with the plant itself. And what he's saying is there are people here who have this wrong, that they're ignoring the conditions and they're trying to focus on the plant and make the plant bend to their will. And you can't do that. You can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of the progressives that he's referred to, even though a lot of the pushback he got in America were from academics, it's people blinded by their own, it might be great ambition to help the country and help the poor and help everyone who's disenfranchised. But they're, like you said, they're not looking at the ingredients that went into the flourishing we already have today. They're not even looking at how they got their own position in academia with their privilege to be allowed to just sit there and do, play mind games instead of being out in the fields and working for their own food. So it's kind of this, to go back to, it's not always a malevolent, malicious person who's in there trying to destroy people's lives. It's often people who are like, I think I have a better idea as to how to create more progress much more efficiently and effectively. And they don't look at, the recipe that led us to this point. And that's extremely unfortunate. And, that's when the bad actors will come in after some of those ideas are implemented.
Yep. And he says next, to those bad actors and how they even come in. Progress was taken more and more for granted and was no longer recognized as a result of the policy of freedom. It might even be said that the very success of liberalism became the cause of its decline. Because of this success already achieved, man became increasingly unwilling to tolerate the evil still with him, which now appeared both unbearable and unnecessary. And to your point, because of that, their intolerance for the black spots on society, as he said, which is good to acknowledge them, then people were willing to use any means necessary to address the social problems. And that includes, not includes, but it creates the possibility for them to be exploited by bad actors who are like, I'll fix it. Just give me the power. I'll fix it. We don't need those old rules. We don't need those old, mechanisms. What's freedom anyway? And we'll get into how we change the definition of freedom.
Or they simplify it and say they distill all of the bad things happening into one group.
Yep.
The Jews are doing it. This is why we get rid of them, right? So it's a common theme, but this is where the reason I like this quote a lot is because they talk about the evils that are still within man. And a lot of socialism, especially as it moves into the future, is this belief that we are not bound in any way to the human condition, right? We can alleviate ourselves of all the negative aspects of our condition, and we're kind of these blank slates that are able to buy into a narrative full stop without needing to worry about any of our own personal growth or our own ideas. And this is why, this is how Marx got it so wrong. He did not understand the human condition at all. And that is why we talk so often about incentives, is because incentives and disincentives are the best way to get people to do what's best for society, as opposed to coercion, which are just going to normally make people upset, or it's going to target one group in the favor of another group. And that's where you end up in a totalitarian state. And I like how he exemplifies the evils within man that people see when they're, and this is also too, when it comes to, climate change, right?
Yep.
The countries that are most effective in fighting against climate change are the rich countries. It's not because they feel or they're forced to do things that are better for the environment is because they have the time to do it, right? Yep. They're so prosperous. They have to worry so little about where they're going to get their next meal from. They have all this extra time to say, you know what, I'm going to buy a Tesla instead of driving a huge truck. I'm going to do all these different things to make the climate better. And it's that prosperity that allows them to do that. And by reversing this prosperity trend, you're going to try to force people to do things that they're not going to want to do. And at some point in that coercion calculus there, the threat of the government gun is going to come in at some point, and that's where you get to a totalitarian state.
Yeah, and as I think one of the things he says later, maybe one of the quotes you have, but as things are more and more collectivized, the opportunities for an individual to do something different shrink, and coercion becomes more and more of a necessary force in the enforcement of those collective decisions, which are of course not really collective. It's top down from a small group. But so he goes on, and this is the part, or all of this is good, but this kind of gets to the crux of something that I've talked about before that I think is worth mentioning again. They said, he continues, because of the growing impatience of the slow advance of liberal society, and those who, just to pause, might go back to the first video, there's a quote that he mentions, I think in the 73 version, where he goes back to this again, the same thing he had noticed, maybe it was 76. Yeah. And he again brings this up because he was seeing it happen in the US, where people were impatient for gradual progress. And so they're implementing all these shortcuts. And so, but again, as you said, at what cost? Because of the growing impatience with the slow advance of liberal policy and the just irritation with those who use liberal phraseology in the defense of antisocial privileges, and the boundless ambition seemingly justified by the material improvements already achieved, it came to pass toward the turn of the century, the belief in the basic tenets of liberalism, again, think freedom and liberty, was more and more relinquished. What had been achieved came to be regarded as a secure and imperishable possession, acquired once for all. So to contrast with the garden thing, he's saying people just thought you have it and it's there for good, not something that requires care and attendant and maintenance to it. The eyes of the people became fixed on the new demands, the rapid satisfaction of which seemed to be barred by adherence to the old principles being freedom and liberty. It became more and more widely accepted that further advance could be expected, not along the old lines of freedom and liberty, within the general framework that had made past progress possible, but only by a complete remodeling of society. It was no longer a question of adding to or improving the existing machinery, but of completely scrapping and replacing it, dismantling, you might say. And as the hope of the new generation came to be centered on something completely new, interest in and understanding of the functioning of the existing society rapidly declined. And with the decline of the understanding of the way in which the free system worked, our awareness of what depended on its existence also decreased. And real fast, people, and I mentioned this before we recorded, but people might be familiar with, I've talked about this before, but one of these like stream of consciousness things I had one time was I wrote all these Post-it notes out while my wife stood by the door patiently. And I came up with this thing I called the theory of expanding aesthetic. The next video is funny. Before I had already decided this is going to be my next video, was talking about what's at stake here right now. And it's this right here. And the theory of expanding aesthetic is that from the first most granular person in society all the way up to an entire civilization, for everything, every single thing that we depend on, the first question we ask is, what does it need? And then the second question is, what do I want it to look like? And that begins on practical terms. So a person, the first Native American forms a pot, and it's what does it need? It needs to hold water. It has to be it has to function. And then once it holds water, then I can ask, well, maybe I want to put some designs on the side. And same with your house. You have to know what it needs. So you don't start with wallpaper. You start with walls. You start with the roof. You start with a foundation. Like, it has to work. Then you can fiddle with the decorations, and you expand out from a house to a neighborhood, to a village, to a city, or to a country. And the point is, you always start with, what does it need to function? What does it need to work? And then once it has what it needs, you can make aesthetic changes to it. And those changes can go from physical to existential to philosophical to what do I want society to look like in terms of equality of opportunity and those kinds of things. So, okay, Black people don't have the right to vote. They're slaves or whatever. That needs to change. So I want it to look differently. I want society to actually live up to the Constitution and treat all men as equals before God. And so that's the point. But today we see people who are so far removed of what does it need that they only engage with what I want it to look like, and they are fiddling with stuff without knowing that they're moving from the realm of aesthetic into the physical, into the needs of it. The example I thought of earlier was like Jenga. It's like if you don't know anything about physics, it's like they're taking the blocks out of the bottom of the tower, thinking that those are pretty. I'll put those on top, and yeah, it's right, exactly. And they have no idea they're going to bring the whole thing tumbling down. Again, to use the house metaphor, they're not taking out the wallpaper; they're taking out load-bearing walls because they don't know they're load-bearing. And so that's what Hayek is saying here, is that people have become so preoccupied with these other things that their own personal goals of what they want society to look like or be like or feel like for them, even if those are laudable goals, that they do not understand what the mechanisms are that brought them to this place of the most material wealth. Again, this is even in the 40s, but if you compare 1940 England to 1840 England, or good Lord, 1640 England, I mean, it's not even close. It's not even close. And so he's saying there is a thing that got us here, and people have become so detached from what got us here. They're just wanting to do these other things, and they're taking out the load-bearing walls. And I think that's, a serious threat here today, that people, that is a problem of progress. I mean, that's Bain, right? Victory has defeated you. I think Jeremy Bentham brought it up in the video that we did, and it's totally right. It's like, this is defeat by your own victory.
Yeah, I mean, you did a great job of explaining how, not understanding how it got here is really doing you a disservice when you are here. But also, I think it's, perfectly summed up in the one sentence from the quote. It was no longer a question of adding to or improving the existing machinery, but completely scrapping and replacing it. It is like a rich kid inheriting a $1.2 million Bugatti that has a broken headlight and scrapping it.
Yep.
Like understand what it was to have a Model T and then go to a Bugatti and being like, well, it's got a defect, so I'm going to toss it. I can't drive it at night. There's all these things. Rather than trying to fix that one little thing, I'm going to scrap the whole system. I mean, it is truly,
and try to build a better car from the parts.
Yeah, for sure. Or or start from scrap and look at a bird and be like, I can model it after a bird, and let's scrap this, sports car, $1.2 million sports car, and say, I can start with better, rather than building on, it's okay to say like, all right, this is a really nice car, but I think I could even make it faster, and start making small tweaks to it as you go along, right? That's that ambition part. You should be ambitious to make the system better. You should be ambitious to really take out the ills of society. It's a great goal to do that, but when it means you got to take away liberty in order to do that, in order to coerce people to buy into your narrative, how your idea of how to make the system better, you are going off the road, quite literally, right? Because it was the absence of that, it was the absence of that coercion that led you here, right? So it's the idea that if one little thing goes wrong, it's time to scrap the whole system. And that is an awful idea. And that is how you get a lot of people hurt at best.
And it's an idea born of ignorance, right? Because it doesn't have the awareness. And I think this is where we see the value of real education in this country, is that if you don't have an awareness of the past, if you don't have an awareness of, a true awareness of the past, not some 1619 awareness of the past, then it's going to be easy to just compare today to today. And not today to 30 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, or to other places at the same time. Let's compare the US in 1960 to the Soviet Union in 1960, or to Ukraine, dear God, and so, or to China in the 1960s and 70s. If you don't have that, then you're going to think that you can just fiddle with it. As I've heard Jordan Peterson say before, it's like the odds of you being able to completely restructure society and actually improve it are virtually zero. the odds of you making it worse, including like into a living hell, are almost a certainty. And I think it was maybe in a conversation he had with Sam Harris where they gave the example of, I want to say it was like a scaffolding versus a foundation. He's like, there's these people who think that these principles of society are like like when you're building a building, it's like the scaffolding around the outside of the building, that once the building is complete, you can just take it and it doesn't impact the building. In fact, it might make it better because now people can actually see it and all those other things, where really these are not scaffolding type things. These are not, little minor details. This is the foundation of the building. And you can't do that. But if you don't have an awareness of what the process of building that was like, then you very well might mistake one for the other. And again, remove that block out of the bottom of the Jenga tower. And, in some, I would say, just incredibly prideful and naive, presumptive assumption that you're actually going to be able to improve it, which is, I just think, insane. It's so reckless. It's so reckless. So do you want to bring us to the end of chapter 1 here, to a close? You had some quotes here that you had talked about. Oh, here, really fast before that, I want to include one more quote. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just saw it. He kind of closes that section that I just mentioned, where he talks about the kind of this intellectual snobbery towards the past. And he talks about how these intellectuals would discredit the results of the past study of society, which did not conform to their prejudices, and impose ideals of organization on a fear to which they are not appropriate. And so, we see this again today, where people are applying their standards to the past and to the people who built the society we're in, and saying, well, they don't conform to my personal prejudices. And so, to hell with all of them, and to hell with all their ideas. I can do a better job. And we see that today. And again, to Hayek's point, it's like people will say, and we'll come back to this, that, well, the United States and England in 2021 is much more advanced and much more prosperous than it was in 1940 or 1930 or 1950 or whatever. And to Hayek's point, one, it's gradual, and two, there are ways in which we can markedly, and I know we'll get into this later, in videos, that the gradual process of moving from individualism to collectivism has advanced rapidly in that time. And so we are much closer to an authoritarian, totalitarian kind of state now in these places, despite all of our technological advancement, than we were, I think, in 1940 or 1950 or 1960.